Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. It is me again, Zach, with the final part of our tier list for Barony's classes. Today we're going to be getting into the last DLC, which is the Legends and Pariahs. Now, this is not a DLC review, but just going briefly into what this provides you. You get access to 4 new races and 4 new classes. Each race is tied to a class, just like in the previous Myths and Outcasts DLC that we talked about in the last video. The 4 races you get access to are the Automaton, the Incubus, the Goblin, and the Insectoid. Now, I already made a tier list of the different races in Barony. Isn't it great that you can do that in video games? Because who buddy, be a bad look in real life. But getting into the classes, because that's what we're talking about, I'm not going to be going over any of the races in too much detail, except in how they relate to the classes specifically. We're going to be getting into it now. And I mean, into it. This is the Mechanist class. It is the Automaton's signature class, or race signature class, however that's said. It is complicated, to say the least, in a way very similar to the Brewer, which I mentioned in the last video. Because the way that the Brewer works is it's essentially a normal class, but you get access to alchemy from the beginning of the game. The Mechanist is that, but for the tinkering skill. I think overall the tinkering skill is much less complicated than the alchemy one. But it is still very complicated. There's still a lot to do. It's just a little bit more simple to kind of grok. Like, it's a little bit more simple to understand, right? Now let's get into the Mechanist specifically here. Starting stats: 25 HP, 20 MP. Not great. You are pretty squishy, and you have very little mana. This is not the end of the world, but, you know, is a noticeable weakness of yours. Starting attributes: -2 strength. This one's kind of a bummer. We'll talk about it in the gameplay section a bit. 1 dexterity, however, kind of compensates. That's pretty good. -3 constitution. Squish. Also 1 int, 0 perception, and 0 charisma. Some of that will be overcome based off of your starting equipment. We'll get there in just a moment. Your starting skills are as follows. Trading, 10. Alchemy, 10. Ranged, 10. It sort of just is what it is. However, tinkering, 40. That is your bread and butter. That's about all you do, really. Now, what is interesting about the Mechanist, just talking about this before we get into their stat weights and stuff, they're really not tied very much to their stats. They are more about their starting equipment and what they can do with it. So don't lose too much hope if all of this sounds pretty atrocious thus far. In terms of stat weights, you have a 35% weight towards strength and constitution, meaning you are not a melee boy, and you never will be. Without like serious investment in time and resources that would be better spent elsewhere. And in addition to that, you are pretty squishy in general, so something to keep in mind. You do, however, have a 57% weight towards dexterity, which makes you pretty good at any kind of ranged combat. It's your second highest stat weight. You have 51% to intelligence and charisma. The charisma's whatever. Much like with the Brewer, it is a bit more useful for you because being able to trade does come in handy early on. Being able to buy things to scrap them, or even buy things to get involved in alchemy as Mechanist can be kind of good, because you can sort of do both. But it's still charisma, it's still not great. The intelligence is kind of nice. It does mean you can kind of scale into being a mage if you want. It's not quite as good as your ranged combat bonuses, but it is something you can do. Finally, you have 68% towards perception, which is obviously, your bread and butter, super fantastic, very strong, very good, because it affects your tinkering skill and your tinkering in general. Tinkering is a bit difficult to level into the late game, but having a really high tinkering skill allows you to repair most things in the game, and you can kind of trick that by having a really high perception, right? Because it adds to your tinkering skill when you are performing tinkering feats. So keep that in mind. Perception, very good for you, and feeds into the whole ranged combat thing quite a bit. Now, starting equipment, you start with a crossbow. And I don't know what it is, but this crossbow does not seem to break nearly as quickly as the Arcanist's. I don't know why. I think it might be placebo, because I just don't use it as much when playing Mechanist. You also start with a leather apron, which is +2 perception as well as burning resistance. Now, keep in mind, burning resistance, if you fall in lava, you will still burn to death. However, if you are lit on fire by an enemy, no you're not, is essentially how it works. So it is still very handy to have that, and having +2 perception takes your starting level of 0 and bumps it up to 2. You can actually get it to 3 before even leaving spawn, if I remember correctly. We'll talk about that here in a moment. You also start with 2 bear traps. Now, as we covered with the ninja class, the bear traps are really powerful for clearing the gnomish mines, and that is key, right? Or at least key to early game. You also start with 2 empty bottles. You can use that to get water out of fountains or potions from the fancy fountains. It's kind of good for that if you care about alchemy. If you don't, you can scrap it. You start with 4 lockpicks. These are useful because early on it's a good way to get your tinkering skill up a little bit higher, and since you start with a decent tinkering skill, you can already unlock some stuff. So it's kind of handy. If you start with someone like a sexton that has the unlock spell, or someone who starts with a staff of opening like the Arcanist, it's maybe a little bit less useful, but generally when I'm playing in multiplayer with a Mechanist, and it is my my friend's favorite class, seemingly. If you're starting with someone who is a Mechanist, I would let them unlock doors wherever possible to squeeze every drop of tinkering skill they can out of the game. You also start with a tinkering kit. Now, we're going to talk about that more in a moment, but that is the tinkering version of an alembic. It allows you to start playing the video game, right? You also have 2 apples, 2 cheese, a bonus potion of polymorph if you are a monster, and 16 metal scrap, 8 magic scrap. Now, that's not everything you have. But we're now going into the gameplay element of the Tinkerer, okay? We're getting into the traps and the bots. So with the Tinkering Kit, you are able to craft traps and bots. Bots are essentially sentries that perform various tasks for you. They play the video game, they fight for you. And traps are things you can set down in clusters as well, and they do anything from teleport enemies somewhere else, or put enemies to sleep, or explode them. When you start the game, you start with a sleep trap, which is, I think, mediocre. I think the sleep trap is okay early on, but not anything crazy. You start with a dummy bot. That one is pretty useful. You can throw that one down in an area and then kind of lead enemies to it, and they will de-aggro from you to attack it if you kind of like run past it. And then you also have a sentry bot, which essentially is a crossbow on stilts. It shoots for you. I highly recommend that you shoot stuff that your turrets are shooting to get your own skill up as you go, because unlike with someone like the Conjurer or the Mesmer or anyone else who does leadership things, your turret's level doesn't matter. It's tied to other stuff, right? I think it's tied exclusively to your character level. Turrets, in fact, just simply lose quote-unquote durability as time goes on until eventually they break, and then you can scrap them and use part of old turrets to make new ones. I'm not going to explain the full tinkering subclass here, like subsystem here, much like I didn't explain alchemy in full detail, but I will note a couple of things. One, if you really want to get your perception as high as humanly possible, or if you just want to be a real bro for a teammate, like a conjurer or something, you can craft, at the start of the game, you can craft, I think, 1 or 2 pairs of glasses. And you can give that to, say, a conjurer who has negative perception and just cannot appraise things. And you can possibly give yourself a pair as well, which helps with your ranged combat because perception affects ranged crits. But also, because your perception affects your tinkering skill, and it will make you even more powerful just by putting on a pair of glasses. This is pretty good, I'd say. They can also craft, God, all kinds of stuff. Things like lanterns, empty bottles, that sort of thing. Early on, I highly recommend building a couple of bots for the gnomish mines and just kind of tossing them into the main room. But by and large, traps are usually the way you want to go as you scale through the game because they're a little bit lighter and you can throw them down in a pile in the starter room and then just let enemies walk into them and they explode and die instantly. Early game, it's a bit rough for you. You are very squishy, extremely squishy, very easy to kill. You can be cut in half in like 3 hits from most enemies on like normal difficulty. It's rough. With careful usage of your traps and bots, you can compensate for that quite a bit by letting them do the fighting for you. However, it is a bit rough until you kind of understand the mechanics. However, I think that by and large, Mechanist is actually, as a high reward class, I think they're an A tier. I'm kind of torn between A and B though. And if we look at their stat weights, we see they are perception based, they have decent int, and they have okay dex, but they're squishy and weak in melee. So, is that high reward? I would say yes. But it is kind of a near run thing. I think that it is kind of difficult to put a late game mechanist over a late game merchant. And if it weren't for the fact that the merchant is so charisma focused, and these guys are so good at ranged and magic in the late game, they probably would be down here in B tier, right? But they are easier overall to play than the Brewer because, like, yeah, the Brewer is tankier as time goes on, but it's easy to learn to kite, right? And it's easy to learn to let your robots fight for you. And the way that tinkering works is you basically open your tinkerer's kit and then you pick what you want to build and then you toss it on the ground, right? Whereas the Brewer is like, what potion combinations make potions? What does it mean when it's a bubbly potion versus some other modifier? What does it mean when a potion is blessed or cursed? How do you get them? Where do you go? What do you do? Who is anything, right? So overall, while they are, I would argue that the Brewer actually is more powerful in the late game in terms of stat weights. Overall, the Mechanist is just easier to play in the early game. Still not low risk. You can die so easily. But they aren't quite high risk because, again, anyone can learn to kite. If all you do is throw down your robots when enemies are near you, you'll probably end up doing okay after a floor or two. So, there you go. In terms of races, I will note that Automaton obviously makes this race much easier. It's a robot. The Automaton gets plus 20 to their tinkering skill when repairing items, which means they can repair all kinds of stuff straight out of the gate. They're crazy at repairing. In addition, you can have an easy time eating scrap that you produce for your Mechanist as an Automaton. And since you're playing as a class that doesn't rely on having high mana, you don't even have to maintain your boiler super high unless you want to, right? You can kind of let it run a bit low and just suffer some basic movement speed penalties if you're careful. overall pretty good. Once again, I will try and remember to put a link to a tinkering guide in the description, so if you're interested in this class, highly recommend you look up one of those or follow the one that I post. Next up, we have the Punisher. The Punisher is an interesting class because they are something of a challenge class, but not quite as much as some of the other ones in my opinion. The Punisher is the BDSM class. Let's just get that out of the way right now. It's a GIMP mask. He's wearing a GIMP mask. Incubi always kind of look like they have a ball gag in, and he has got a whip. It is what it is. Moving on. Starting stats, 30 health, 30 mana. Pretty straightforward, pretty balanced, obviously. Not bad at either thing. They're not super squishy, which is nice. I think anything under 30 is squishy, so keep that in mind. And anything under 30 mana is low, so they're right on the cusp of both, doing great. Starting stats, strength, -1, dex, 1, con, -1, int, -1, perception and charisma, 0. So, bit of a mixed bag on this one. The bonus to dex and the neutral perception and charisma is all fine, but getting minuses to the other 3 stats, which are all pretty core to playing the video game, bit rough. Bit fucking rough. They are struggling on that front for sure. Starting skills, however, they have some decent bonuses. They get 20 in magic, 40 in casting, 25 in ranged, and 25 in axes, which is a decent spread of offensive capabilities. They are very low on the defensive capabilities, you may have noticed here. But the biggest weakness is that they have 20 in magic, which really keeps them from learning any really cool spells straight out of the gate. You have decent casting, but just not doing so hot on the magic front. Stat weights, they have 55% in strength. This is really good immediately because it means that you can transition into using axes late game and you can be very powerful, right? They also have 55 in perception and charisma. The charisma is a bummer, but is not surprising for a class that uses the incubus, one of the 2 seductive classes, as kind of its whole signature deal. So it is what it is, but it is not great that charisma is so high. Perception is cool. Honestly though, not great. Kind of doesn't make sense that they're good at perception, because their next highest is dexterity and intelligence. So they're like okay at damaging effects with ranged and magic and melee, but they're just not very good. I don't know. I feel like dexterity should be tied for their highest stat, not perception. But that being said, as noted, dexterity and intelligence are their second highest options, so they can transition well into a high DPS build for any of the 3 combat styles. Their biggest weakness is that they have Constitution as a dump stat. It's not great. It is what it is, but it's not great. Moving on to their starting equipment, they have a Crystal Axe, which, massive damage, breaks easily. That's the description in the guide, that's the description in the game. I would recommend not using it too much. Maybe use it to kill somebody to steal their axe. That would be pretty good. However, more importantly, they have the Whip. The Whip is really interesting, and I'm pretty sure that the guide that I'm looking at, it has like a little mini guide at the bottom of the Punisher section to talk about the Whip. So we'll talk about it more in the gameplay section, and I'll kind of go through some of that with you guys. However, they also have the Executioner's Hood. Now, the Executioner's Hood is honestly pretty powerful. It's a unique helmet. It gives a % chance to bleed on sneak attacks, similar to what the Accursed had, actually, but not just unarmed, it's any kind of sneak attack. And anytime you sneak attack something, you also get a mana regen boost, which is obviously pretty powerful. especially because you are kind of a stealthy boy. But with no starting stealth, you do have to kind of keep in mind you got to play a little bit extra safe in the first couple levels. You also have a Ring of Conflict, which causes all nearby enemies to turn on each other. All NPCs will just start hitting one another, so keep that in mind. If you're playing in multiplayer, be careful, because this will cause entities that might normally be neutral to a teammate to attack them. For instance, if your friend is playing a goblin, you put on the Ring of Conflict in the swamp area, the goblins in the swamp will attack your goblin friend because they are just that angry about everything. So the biggest thing about this is that you can have enemies start hitting each other and then you run in and get free sneak attacks by punching them in the asshole really hard. Highly recommend doing that every now and then, but it is more useful when you are playing by yourself or in a very controlled group scenario, like maybe where it's just you and one friend and you both know when you're putting the ring on. In addition, they have the Teleport Other spell. This is an innate spell. They actually have 2 innate spells. The Teleport Other spell will teleport an enemy to you, but also disorients them, causing them to turn around and face the other direction, allowing you to get a free sneak attack on them. It's pretty good. I personally never get much use out of it, but I think that if you practice with it, it would be really powerful. You also have the Inner Demon innate spell, which both of these are completely unique to the Punisher class, though I think you can find Teleport Other elsewhere. I'm pretty sure that that one can be found in the world, but the Inner Demon spell cannot be. That one causes an enemy that you hit with the spell to basically be attacked by an illusion of themselves that's squishier, but I think does about the same amount of damage. It's a good distraction. It's another way that you can get enemies to fight each other, in quotes, so that you can then sneak up and hit them from behind. Overall, the Punisher is a very freeing class. It can kind of do whatever, but I think that because of its relatively weak early game and mediocre scaling, I think it does kind of fall into B tier. I'm going to be leaving it here. I will put it above Merchant because I think that the freedom offered by the Punisher class is high, whereas the Merchant kind of falls off late game because its shtick kind of disappears. The Punisher kind of pops off late game, right? Overall, though, I don't think it's quite high risk. I will say that much because we're about to talk about the whip, but because of the whip, I just can't really say that it is super risky to play this class in comparison to any others. So let's talk about the whip. The whip is a weird weapon. First off, it is the only hybrid scaling weapon in the game, right? Reading that verbatim from the guide, but it's true. It is the only weapon in the game that scales off of 2 different stats, in this case, strength and dex, which is really weird and cool, right? It means that early on when you have a decent dexterity modifier of 1, you're at least getting some kind of damage bonus, even though your strength kind of cancels it out. In addition to that, it also is attached to the ranged skill, right? Which is weird. So using it can be kind of counterintuitive if you're looking at other weapons, you know? It's not tied to a melee skill, even though it is itself a melee weapon. It should be noted that the whip has a much longer range than any other melee weapon in the game. It's like the whole world is kind of split up into blocks in a weird sort of way. It's like a 2-block range compared to the most of a block range the other ones have. I would recommend hitting a wall and getting as close to a wall as you can, hitting it, and then backing up while still spamming it until you can no longer hit the wall to get an idea for how far away you can stand from enemies to hit with it. What makes the whip so cool, other than the fact that it scales off of 2 different attributes and is attached to the range skill, the other thing that makes it cool is that with the Executioner's Hood, you get the high bleed chance. And with the whip, you can make sneak attacks from further away than most other characters. You can very safely make a sneak attack and then book it to the other side of the map before the enemy has time to turn around and walk towards you, which makes it just generally really powerful. It is also able to, because of the sneak attack mana regen bonus, augment mage playstyles by getting the occasional sneak attack and then switching back after you've regened up your mana. Kind of weaving those whip attacks in there. As I said, I don't think it scales as well as a lot of other classes do, and it does start off kind of weak, but because of its weird starting equipment being so good, I don't know, it's just powerful. Now, in terms of races, I don't think there's much to say about any of them except two. Vampire is a bit easier to play with this class than other races are in a lot of ways, because any time that you sneak attack something, you have a higher chance of them, well, sorry, when you get an assassination, when you sneak attack something and it dies, you have a higher chance of getting blood from them. In fact, it might actually be a 100% chance of getting blood if you assassinate an enemy. But the Punisher also gives you more mana regen, which is really good so that you can use the extremely powerful bloodletting spell that vampires have as well, which, if they die from that spell, it's guaranteed blood. So either way, lots of good blood. However, it should also be noted that the Incubus, which is the signature race of the Punisher, is weird. It's kind of a side grade. It's not as powerful as the Vampire is when playing Punisher, but what the Incubus does have is Arcane Mark, which is, if I remember, you can cast Arcane Mark on something and then use Teleport Other. No. Or maybe. I think you can use Teleport Other after you've marked a different enemy with Arcane Mark, and then when you Teleport Other, it will move the target you hit with that spell to the target of the Arcane Mark. But I could be wrong. I know that you can use Arcane Mark on an enemy, and then use Teleport to essentially appear behind your enemy to get a free sneak attack. So you do have options like that with the Incubus. But all of that is weird and kind of a side deal, right? As I noted before, I haven't gotten much use out of Teleport Other personally, so while I think that there's a strong playstyle tied to it, I've never really gotten it to work the way that maybe I would want it to. Overall, I think sticking predominantly to just playing a pretty normal stealth way, and then using your whip a lot is sort of the way to play the Punisher. So, like I said, they go in perfectly in mid B tier, which is pretty good. They're overall pretty solid. I think they are okay in the late game, and they are okay in the early game once you get the hang of their basic playstyle. Slightly weak in the early game compared to like the Barbarian. Probably a little bit weak compared to the Merchant, but I think they scale better than the Merchant, so meh. But then we get into one of the most interesting classes in the game. And I know I keep saying things like that, but this is another one that is very, very, very unique. This is the Shaman class. This is the signature class of the Goblin. And it's going to be a wild ride, so buckle up and bear with me here. We might be talking about this one for the next 30 years or so. Starting stats, 35 HP, putting them slightly above bad. They're actually pretty tanky, all things considered. But they also have 40 mana, which is awesome, right? Their starting attributes are -1 to Strength, 0 in Dexterity and Constitution, 2 in Intelligence, 1 Perception, and 1 Charisma. This is a pretty good starting array. I mean, compared to the Punisher with a bunch of negatives, this one is pretty solid, all things considered. The low strength does hurt a bit, but everything else is pretty nice. Their starting skill points are Alchemy, 10, Casting and Magic, 40, Stealth and Unarmed, both 10. Pretty weak on the skill front, not gonna lie to you. Their stat weights are ? We will get to that when we talk about gameplay. Uh, their starting equipment. They start with a bronze sword. It's useless. It's not great. You can level swords if you want, especially if you're playing as a race where you want to get really high swords so that you can transition into using the artifact sword. But otherwise, I often just huck the bronze sword into the garbage bin as quickly as possible. You do start with 3 rocks, which you can throw at enemies. You can kind of use them to kite in a similar way to the Sexton's Chakrams, but obviously weaker. If you're worried about it, you can toss them to reduce your weight as well. That's fine. The next bit that you have the Magical Staff of Poison, which is a staff of poison. It just poisons enemies. It's a bit weird. Compared to other staffs, it might come off as a bit weak, right? Because comparing it to like the Fireball staff that the Arcanist starts with, or the Lightning staff of the Conjurer, the Poison staff takes a while to do its damage. It's really good, however, at fighting trolls and enemies of that nature. Something big you can chuck the damage onto and then run away from. I often get quite a bit of value out of the Poison staff when playing as a shaman. The next bit is the Enchanted Feather. They are the only one who starts with a feather. And it doesn't do anything for you right away, but you can use it to repair books, and you can use it to scribe scrolls, so it is pretty powerful on that front. The fact that you can use it to repair spellbooks is good for the goblin specifically, because goblins cannot learn spells permanently unless they're innate. Now, you also get the bonus Potion of Polymorph if you're playing as any of the monster races, as all of these signature classes provide. So, let's see here. You also get the Shaman Mask. So we're kind of transitioning now into the gameplay elements of this class, because the Shaman Mask is very unique, and pretty much unique purely for the Shaman. It is possible to find the Shaman Mask elsewhere in the world. In the swamps, there are occasionally goblin shamans that spawn, which don't actually do much shamany, but they do, I think, spam poison at you, which is pretty uncool of them. But no other class can benefit from the shaman's abilities, so it's kind of a moot point. It doesn't really matter. What the Shaman Mask does is it gives you double mana regen while in any of your creature forms, and that is, of course, the last thing we have to talk about with the Shaman class, except stat weights, and it's why we couldn't talk about stat weights before now. So, when you start the game, you have one innate spell, and then its counter. Alright? You have Rat Form and Revert Form. Revert Form does the same thing in all of your forms. It just turns you back into your normal race, right? But the Rat Form spell does pretty much what it says on the tin. It turns you into a rat, right? While in Rat Form, you get a bonus to your Dexterity, Intelligence, and Perception, which is pretty good. You can cast the Revert Form spell at any point while you are in Rat Form to become Unrat Form. And as you go through the game, the rat gets access to Detect Food and Speed as spells that it learns while in rat form. But this is why you don't really care about the sword that you start with. You ditch it because you're pretty much immediately going to transition into using purely unarmed attacks throughout the game, right? Especially while you are in your animal form. Once you hit a certain level, you get access to new forms. The next one is Spider Form, which gives Strength, Constitution, and Perception. This is a pretty good form. Starting off, it gets access to the Web effect. When enemies are webbed, any melee attack you make against them knocks them away. So this is not crazy useful, but it's great for kiting trolls around and other big enemies that are not immune to knockback. You can hit them with the web, bump them away. After that, you get the Troll form, which is one of the most powerful. It gives Strength and Con, a lot of it, but lowers your dex while you're transformed, so you're a bit slower. The troll form melee bonuses for like unarmed, pretty powerful, all things considered. And I should note here that any of the forms that you have can make alliances with creatures of the same type, and they are passive to them. So spiders won't attack you when you're a spider, and you can make friends with them. Same with rats when you are in rat form, and trolls when you are in troll form. So I think trolls will still attack you if you get too close, because that's how trolls work. You can also make friends with the specific mini-boss of each animal type, but generally when you first meet these mini-bosses, they're a bit too strong for you. They're a bit too high level. So it's often, like, it seems to be mostly impossible to get Algernon. I know that you can probably get him at some point or another. I've never gotten lucky enough. My leadership has always been too low. So that's something to keep in mind. The final form, though, is Imp form. Imp form gives you permanent levitation while the form is active, and gives you int and perception while transformed. It should be noted here that all of these forms have a time limit. Sorry about that, had a little bit of a recording kerfuffle. So, because every one of these spells has a time limit, if you are an imp and you are levitating over an abyss and it wears off, you plummet and die. Keep that in mind. You can use revert form to turn back, but it has a mana cost, right? So you don't want to do that too often. Generally, you want the timer to wear off. While you are transformed, you are obviously getting boosted mana regen. So again, it is highly recommended that you stick in that form as long as humanly possible to best take advantage of those bonuses. Now, the guide points out something that I forgot. I'm glad that this is here. As a spider, you can actually recruit scorpions and scarabs as well, which means that the spider kind of lasts a bit longer than you would expect in terms of getting useful allies, because scorpions can be kind of handy to have, and scarabs are actually pretty tanky against certain enemies. So, the reason why, however, that I had to mention that the stat weights would have to be in the gameplay section is because while you are transformed, you get different stat weights. So when you are a rat, you will have a really high stat weight towards dexterity and a little bit of a stat weight towards int. When you level up as a spider, you will focus on perception with a little bit of constitution. When you level up as a troll, it's a heavy focus on strength, lesser focus on constitution. And then the imp is essentially the opposite of the rat. It's heavy focus on intelligence, and a little bit with dexterity. Now I should note here, because I mentioned that I'm looking at a guide, and I don't know if I've mentioned it in this video yet. I'm trying to plug this every single chance I get. I'm using a guide on Steam made by some fantastic individual. I will link it in the description. It's in all of the tier list descriptions, because this guy knows his stuff, or her stuff. They're awesome. This guide has been super helpful. It's how I have a lot of the grittier details for this. But that all being said, the way that you play Shaman is really tied to... It's really tied to what you want to do, right? If you want to be a mage, you can stay in imp form while leveling up, and you can get crazy high intelligence. I've had like 70 plus intelligence as an imp before. If you want to be a melee boy, just stick to troll whenever possible, get crazy high strength. I actually would recommend sticking in troll form quite a bit in the mid game, because strength and constitution's pretty good for any playstyle, honestly. Just high constitution's always good, so I think it's kind of worth it. But there is something to be said for the fact that Rat will give you some early game dexterity and generally a bit of intelligence as well, and that is nice to have. Whew, there's a lot to talk about with the Shaman. I apologize, but we're not even done yet, because we still have to talk about races, right? So, there's actually quite a few interesting notes here. One, Goatman will still get hangovers, even when transformed. And that is a bit of a bummer. Now, it is kind of nice that you can, in your Goatman form, you can be a tanky boy, but because the drunk bonuses do not carry over to your animal forms, there's not a lot of synergy there, right? The succubus and the incubus do not get bonuses from cursed items while they're transformed, which means you don't want to curse your equipment at all. And since they don't want to wear blessed equipment unless they have to, in their normal forms, you really want all of your equipment to have no effects whatsoever, which just is arbitrarily weakening you. I just can't really recommend that class race combo, frankly. The insectoid. That name left my brain for a moment there, sorry. The insectoid is a little bit difficult. You don't benefit from the bonus mana regen from the shaman mask because you don't have mana. You have energy. Which is a bit of a bummer, right? Now you can do things that are kind of cool, like in rat form you get access to detect food, and I'm pretty sure in rat form you can eat moldy cheese, but insectoids can already do that, so like who cares, I guess. Overall, it's not the most difficult. You just have to be very, 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 very careful about your transformations, right? You just so incredibly careful, and there's a lot of overlap between the shaman class and the insectoid anyway, so there's not a whole lot of reason to do this race class combo. Like, you already have poison as an innate spell as an insectoid. Why would you want the staff of it, right? It's not that helpful. Yeah, being able to levitate all the time as an imp is cool, but you can already do that as an insectoid from level 1 with admittedly a weaker levitate. It's flutter, but still, like, you have access to it. So, meh, you know, like, all of it kind of comes off as being a bit mediocre in comparison to some of the other ones. I would agree that it is a bit harder, even. The goblin is the signature race of the shaman class, and there's not a whole lot to note here, except that because all of your spells are innate, like notably the imp the imp gets several unique spells. I didn't cover all the spells that everything gets, just the ones that the rat gets, but the imp gets several on their own, the troll gets a few, and the spider does as well. All of those are innate, so the goblin doesn't have to read a book to learn them, which means that they have access to spells if you want to be more of a spellcaster goblin without having to worry about it. It's pretty much the only class that lets you do that consistently, except maybe Conjurer. So, decent. It doesn't make the game any easier for the goblin, but it is strong at least. Now, in terms of making things a bit easier for you, Automaton is kind of an interesting side grade here, right? It really seems like everybody interacts differently with the shaman class. The Automaton eats normal food while transformed into an animal form, and that's kind of interesting, right? Is it good? Meh, I don't know. I don't know if it matters, frankly. I think that it's just, like, fine. Again, I think it's a side grade, similar to the Goblin. But there is one, well, there's actually two classes that are just easier with Shaman, or two races that are easier. Skeleton is the first one. Whenever you transform, you actually are no longer stuck with Skeleton class regen, and you get the Shaman bonus from the mask, right? So that combination means that whenever you transform, you get a ton of mana back, which allows you to actually play more of a mage kind of build with the skeleton, especially once you become an imp, which is pretty cool. You still get access to the extra life as a skeleton, which is always very powerful, and having access to superior mana regen just means that you can get access to that extra life really consistently often. I think that you are still immune to hunger while in animal forms, but I guess even if you weren't, you just turn back into a skeleton, you're not hungry anymore, so whatever, right? Um, and I think that you actually turn to normal animal, like health regen as well when you put your meat suit on as the skeleton. So overall, it's a pretty good life to play a skeleton shaman. I actually haven't really tried that one out, but I'm kind of talking myself into it now. Finally, there's the vampire, the most busted combination of class and race possibly in the game. All right, mana regen bonus. You can spam spells, including bloodletting, and including, of course, levitate to get crazy high casting and magic levels really early. When you are transformed, you can eat normal food, removing the vampire's biggest weakness, arguably. In addition to that, while you are transformed, vampires can go into water. Huh? Are you sure about that one? Are you positive? Yes. And it's fantastic. So, vampires, it's almost too easy, really. The guide lists the difficulty for the vampire as a shaman as a yawn, because it's that deeply boring. So where does the shaman belong on this list? Well, I actually kind of have a controversial take on this. I do think that shaman can be difficult to play for new players. I think it has a bit of a learning curve. I do not think it is that bad, though. I actually think the shaman is the only other class in the game that will be going in S tier. I think they are at the bottom of S tier because they have such a high learning curve. But I think it's notable that the ninja has a high learning curve as well, and they're still in S tier. The overall risks go away at like level 4 for the shaman, right? And it's so easy to get to that point because you just run around as a rat at Mach 10 and perceive everything and just do whatever you want, right? As soon as you get spider form, life starts becoming easy. By the time you have troll form, it's a walk in the park. Once you get imp form, it's all over for the video game. Shaman is arguably the class with the most potential in the entire game. And in fact, specifically, I'm going to put it here, because it's basically if the Joker had unique game mechanics to it and an easier early game, in my personal opinion, right? They even both get access to permanent levitation, which is just so funny. Overall, the Cleric and the Monk are both stronger in the early game, but fall off in comparison to both of these two classes. And I will say you could probably make a Shaman that dunks on any Ninja build, but the Ninja is safer early, so it beats out the Rat Boy by a smidge. But let's get to the final one so I can finally stop talking about the Shaman for a bit. There we go. Let me adjust the screen a bit. There. So we are now at the Hunter. This is another one of those classes that my good friend likes to play. Possibly his favorite class. Unclear to me. Oh man, the screen got all kinds of fucked up when that happened, didn't it? Sorry about that. There you go. I will note here real quick, as we are transitioning to the Hunter though, that in the guide that I linked, there is a level by level breakdown of when you get each of the animal forms. I just want to add that as an addendum real quick here, because if you're curious about it, it tells you when you get not only the individual forms, but when they unlock each of their spells or effects as well. So all of your questions will be answered there. This is a tier list. I don't want to go into a full breakdown. I already spent like 30 minutes talking about the Shaman. So let's get to the Hunter now, okay? The Hunter is, spoiler alert, the quintessential ranged class in this video game. So starting stats, 20 health, 20 mana. You're a squishy boy with no mana. You don't do any of that. And that's fine. Your strength and intelligence are both -3. So you're a big dummy, and you got baby arms, real noodle arms kind of guy. However, your dexterity is 1, and your perception is 3, making you pretty good at range stuff, shockingly enough. Your constitution is -1, making you, again, kind of squishy, though it's not as bad as some classes, so that is good. And then you have 0 in charisma, which is fantastic. We love to see it. Starting skill points are as follows. 50 in swim for some reason, God only knows why, but you do also have 20 in appraisal, which is very handy, especially with your high perception. You can appraise tons of stuff early on. 10 in tinkering, which is kind of cool. You could definitely transition into being a tinkerer, into being a bit of an off-brand mechanist. You have 10 in casting, which is mostly worthless, I'm not going to lie to you, but it's there. 25 in stealth and 50 in ranged. So obviously, 50 in ranged, very helpful. 25 in stealth, honestly, not bad, really. Next up, we have their stat weights. You have 26 in strength and con. That's real bad, I'm not going to lie to you. And then you have 70 in dex and perception. So, spoiler alert again, you're big into the ranged combat stuff. This is the highest dex and perception growth in the game. It's tied with the rogue. You also have 53% for intelligence and charisma. That's mediocre. Obviously, the fact that con is your dump stat is immediately going to bump you down a bit. Right? It is going to bump you down a little bit. But having intelligence being your second highest growth stat overall, well, tied with charisma, that's pretty good. The charisma's whatever. I don't know why that's so high. That one seems kind of weird to me, but maybe it's so that you can do trading and eventually do tinkering. I don't know. Either way, stat weights are pretty much what you'd expect. They are heavily focused on their ranged combat. And that is truly about it. Starting equipment. You start with a longbow. The longbow is essentially... It takes a little bit longer to fire than a normal, short bow, but it will hit a lot harder, and it will also fly farther. So the fly farther part doesn't matter a ton. It's nice, but it won't come up all that often. But certainly the ability to hit harder is nice. You also get a unique weapon, the boomerang. This one is kind of interesting. We're going to talk about that more here in a moment when we get to the gameplay section. The next up is the blindfold of telepathy, which I'm just going to immediately put a pin in that one too. Alright, we'll talk about those two in a moment. Next up, you have iron bracers and leather boots. This gives you a little bit of survivability. Your health is really low, but you can take 1 or 2 hits that you might otherwise have died from with this, so that is nice. You have an amulet of poison resistance. This is kind of funny, because this is the signature class of the insectoid, which is resistant to poison anyway. So that's good. But you can give this to a teammate, which is always nice. Poison resist is consistently useful, at least. You also start with a bunch of arrows that we'll go into in more detail in a moment. 2 scrolls of Conjure Arrow, which, again, talk about in a moment. And then 2 potions of speed, a fish, a meat, and a bonus potion of polymorph if you are playing as a monster class. So, let's talk about some of the stuff they start with. They are the only class that starts with a longbow or a blindfold of telepathy, both of which can be found elsewhere in the game, though. Their biggest unique thing is obviously the boomerang. Right? The boomerang is weird, and it is somewhat divisive, I think. By the way, we'll just get this out of the way now. This is where the hunter is staying. They are the end of B tier. I will talk about that more why here in a moment, but I just wanted to clarify it will not be moving from this position. The boomerang is interesting because you throw it and it comes back to you, as boomerangs are wont to do, but it has travel time. So a lot of people kind of dislike it because they'd rather just spam bow shots consistently rather than waste time, in their eyes, switching to the boomerang. But it is notable. If you get into the rhythm, you can throw the boomerang and then bow shot, bow shot, bow shot. Boomerang comes back to you. Throw the boomerang again. Bow shot, bow shot, bow shot. Just constantly keeping this up. Because the boomerang never breaks, and starts off in I think it might be decrepit actually. I don't remember, but you can use a scroll of repair on it, and you can also enchant it in a variety of ways to eventually make it very powerful. And it becomes a force multiplier over time that when you're weaving it between your bow shots can be very, very, very strong. It will always come back to you, by the way. I don't know what happens if your inventory is full, or does it not leave your inventory, actually? I don't remember. But it's a powerful weapon, and honestly, if nothing else, you could give it to a teammate if you don't care about it, and maybe they could get some value, right? It's a solid weapon, all things considered. Talking about the bows and arrows now. I am a famous ranged hater in this game. I think that ranged combat is generally kind of weak, unfortunately, and I think that most of the ranged classes are kind of always going to be sort of on the lower end, either because they are riskier to play or because they are kind of mid in terms of rewards, right? So we've got Rogue down here who has the same overall scaling as the Hunter, but is much lower because the rewards are generally more mid, and I think that they are a bit riskier. So why is the Hunter up here, even though it's a much squishier class with seemingly far fewer tools, right? Well, we'll be getting to that. We're going to talk about arrows first. Starting with a whole bunch of different types of arrows makes the Hunter class just instantly very versatile, right? In a way that the Rogue simply isn't. And even that the Arcanist isn't in a lot of ways. You get 20 hunting arrows, which poison and slow enemies. You get 40 silver arrows. These are the ones you probably want to use in the early game quite a bit. Although they are good against bosses, I think it's more valuable to use them early to kill skeletons very quickly, because they deal bonus damage to undead, as well as demons. So if you inadvertently summon a succubus, you could mess it up with those. But I think it's better to get that early game advantage of killing skeletons quickly and leveling fast, versus holding on to the silver arrows to deal slightly more damage to the boss, you know? You also start with 40 swift arrows. They deal less damage but fire faster. I think that you can kind of just use these wherever early to spam attacks quickly. They're sort of meaningless, in my opinion. So what it really comes down to is hunting arrows are the powerful ones you save for like trolls and stuff, and swift arrows are what you spam against like humans or goblins, and silver arrows you use on undead, ghouls and whatnot. Maybe holding on to some of them for the secret area in the swamp is a good idea. Arguable, but you also get 2 scrolls of Conjure Arrow, which is cool because it takes up less inventory space to have those 2 in there instead of another couple piles of arrows. But you also have a chance to get things like Fire Arrows, or maybe some of the other ones that you don't have, which is quite good. Overall, the starting equipment of the Hunter is pretty solid, but we haven't talked about part of their kit, so let's talk about it now. Blindfold of Telepathy makes you blind, shockingly enough. However, you can see enemies through walls at almost any distance, it seems. Meaning that you can just, in the spawn room, slap on a blindfold, take a quick glance around, and be like, okay, there are enemies there, there, and there that are nearby. We should deal with them first, right? That's why I'm putting them in the mid-risk. Even though I think they are mid-reward, the Rogue sort of has to rely on enemies to... Well, they kind of have to rely on like sneaking around and scouting with their own eyeballs, whereas the Hunter can look through walls. And in addition, the Hunter is just more powerful in terms of the ranged combat elements than the Rogue is. The Rogue is kind of stuck halfway between Hunter and Mechanist. And to be clear, I do think that the Rogue is good. They aren't quite like the Mesmer or the Accursed, but I will also say that I think that it's better to be good at one thing, or great at one thing, versus okay at multiple things. So, having that Blindfold of Telepathy, being able to scout out enemies from any distance, is so helpful, and in the Gnomish Mines makes things far less painful. Though you have to be careful. There is kind of a cooldown period when you take the blindfold off, where your eyesight kind of has to come back to you after a moment. So you can't wait till the last second to deactivate it, right? And in addition, you have to remember where you're at. If you're just kind of hanging out in the hallway somewhere and you're like, okay, I see it, a gnome is approaching me, and then the lightning gnome just shoots you down the hallway, you're gonna feel like a bit of a dork. So it's important to be cautious about your positioning with this, for sure. You are very, very squishy early on, but you are also one of the highest DPS classes in terms of like ranged combat in the game. I think probably the Hunter is the class. Like, if you want to play ranged combat and you want it to be good, you play this class. All of the other classes are distractions from what this class does fantastically. That's my take on it. In terms of races, I don't really think any of the classes have too much of an interaction with it. Automatons are okay, because I think that if you get your tinkering up high enough, you can repair the boomerang, and they get a bit of a jump start on that. Pretty sure. It might be expensive, but the automaton can hypothetically do that with any, like, even if your friend plays an automaton and goes like wizard or wanderer or something that is not mechanist, they might still be able to repair your boomerang over time. So playing as one yourself just kind of guarantees that you have the opportunity to do that. In addition, I will note that the skeleton is a bit of a good choice for this. Skeleton is a little bit more durable than some of the other classes and gets the extra life to compensate a bit for your early game weaknesses. But in addition to that, skeletons can avoid mana with the hunter build, and they can avoid melee combat, which are the two things that skeletons sometimes, depending, don't want to do, because melee combat means you take damage, you heal very slowly as a skeleton, and magic playstyles mean you use mana, which regens very slowly as a skeleton. So being able to avoid that completely is kind of nice. But overall, that's it. That's the Hunter, and that's the tier list. Next episode, I will do a very short video where I briefly go through the vanilla classes and maybe move some stuff around based off of their Eat My Hat update. I will say, the Rogue, specifically, is probably going to be moving up at some point, because there's no possible way in heaven that the Rogue did not get some kind of hat-related buff. Pretty sure I've already heard of one, and if that is true, it's probably going to be somewhere up here. I don't know where, but it's probably going to be somewhere up here. It would not take much to get it out of D tier, and who knows, maybe some of these other classes got some bonuses too that are worth looking at. But either way, thank you guys for tuning into this, the final of the tier list videos. Next tier list I'm going to be working on for Barony specifically is a spell tier list, though I might start another tier list series here soon as well, so, stay tuned for that. Thank you guys for watching. Don't forget, like, comment, and subscribe, especially if you want to see more of this kind of stuff, because the more you watch Barony, the more Barony stuff I make. Anyway, that's it. Goodbye.